Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Thea Lee, and I am president of the Economic Policy Institute. EPI was founded in 1986 to ensure that the interests of working people are addressed in national, state, and local policy debates with a sharp focus on racial and gender equity. We are delighted to host today's panel, which brings together an extremely distinguished bipartisan group of economists to weigh in on one of the most pressing economic policy issues of the present moment: the urgent need for the federal government to provide substantial state and local aid immediately. Unlike the federal government, state and local governments do not have the capacity to run budget deficits, and they are already faced with an impossible choice. They can cut off essential services, including public health, education, and safety in the middle of a pandemic, laying off workers and gutting economic growth, or they can try to raise revenues, also in the middle of an economic crisis. This is an enormous problem, not just for the states, but for the entire country. The good news is that it is solvable if Senate Republicans will end the logjam and do the right thing. Our panel today includes Josh Bivens, EPI's research director, Benga Ajilori, senior economist at the Center for American Progress, Jason Furman from Harvard University and the Kennedy School, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, Glenn Hubbard from Columbia University and former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under George W. Bush, and Mark Zandi, chief economist with Moodys Analytics and former advisor to Senator John McCain. We are very fortunate to have Heather Long of the Washington Post as our moderator today. Heather will lead a discussion for about half an hour, and then we will take questions from the audience as time allows. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're a reporter, please note your organization. I will turn it over now to Heather.
Thank you, Thea. When you first approached us about doing this panel at the beginning of August, we all thought we'd be sitting here today doing like a post-mortem. What did Congress do? What's actually in that deal they passed? Instead, they haven't passed anything. We've gotten a few executive orders from the president that have left everyone a lot more confused about where we are. And there's no money right now for state and local. And this has become the issue that's really holding up this deal. Obviously, Democrats have put forward a proposal close to $1 trillion of money that they would like to see go to state and local. The White House countered with about $150 billion. That's a pretty big gap. And the president, just half an hour before this, he must have been ready for this panel, just tweeted, "I am ready to spend more money, ready to send more money to state and local governments to save jobs for police, firefighters, first responders, and teachers." So it's a big question mark. Can we move forward? And what we're really going to talk about today, what does a good compromise look like, and what is really needed right now? So to kick things off, let's do an elevator pitch. Well, I want to hear from all of our panelists. If you had 30 seconds in an elevator with a Republican lawmaker to try to convince them, why do we need to do state and local aid now? What would you say? We'll go down the list. It's Benga, Glenn, Jason, Josh, and Mark. So Benga?
Thank you. So first I'm going to start with a meme. I'm going to say that the best time to pass state and local aid was 3 months ago when we saw millions of jobs being lost. The second best time is right now. And the reason why is that there was $150 billion that was given to states, $30 billion given to localities in the CARES Act, but a lot of that was restricted. And the other thing was that rural areas were left out of it. The $30 billion only went to places that have 500,000 people or more. And so for rural areas, we need state and local aid now so that they get the money, especially given what's coming up in the fall between schools and further cases.
I certainly agree with all of that. I actually do spend time with Republican lawmakers, not on an elevator anymore, but on Zoom about this issue. And I make 3 points. One, we should have learned from the Great Recession, from the financial crisis, of the very large costs of failing to come through enough for state and local governments. That is, in econ speak, the multiplier is quite high on doing this. Second is about payroll. There's recent research suggesting that every dollar of additional state aid would support at least 30 cents more payroll from state and local workers, including essential workers. And the third is to get from here to there, meaning to where the economy is going to be after the pandemic. We need to focus on education and training. And a lot of that is done in public universities and community colleges. This is not the time to be cutting support for those organizations. All in, I think support of at least $500 billion in a block grant is needed.
So I would just say, listen to Glenn. That's 2 seconds. For every dollar we spend on state and local assistance, it adds probably $1.70 to the size of the overall economy. There's nothing that economists have studied better and more carefully when it comes to fiscal policy multipliers, probably, than state and local assistance. And finally, if we want to have an economy, we need to have the best shot at doing the best we can with schools. That's going to cost money. You don't spend that money, you don't have kids in school, you don't have parents working, you don't have any of the things that all of us want to have economically and otherwise.
So I think Glenn, Jason, and Benga all hit on the general logic really well. Like, we should learn the lesson of what happened after the Great Recession, when state and local governments, once the Recovery Act aid to states ran out, their spending became a tremendous drag on growth, made that recovery take far longer than it should have. And I would say, in terms of Heather's question about like why now, like, the revenue collapse for state and local governments has begun. If you look at the second quarter of this year, sales taxes for state and local governments fell at a 16% annualized rate. We've probably seen Medicaid enrollments rise by about 5 million between February and July. The budget crunch is already happening for state and local governments. They're making plans for next year about what they're going to do with their budgets. We should give them aid, so part of those plans are not just cutting everything in sight in order to make their budgets balance. And then finally, quickly, the number one national priority is suppressing the virus. We don't get economic growth if we don't do that. There's not been a lot of federal plans or leadership on that front. There has been some pockets of very good state and local leadership on suppressing the virus. The minimum the federal government can do is to make sure that those plans at the state and local level have all the money they need, because nothing happens good in the economy until we get some handle on this virus.
So after that, Heather, I think everyone should be convinced in that elevator. I'm not sure what else I can say. I mean, clearly the economy is struggling. We have double-digit unemployment. We're still down 13 million jobs from the pre-pandemic peak. State and local governments are hemorrhaging red ink, and it's coast to coast. It's politically ecumenical. Every state municipality is struggling and responding by slashing payrolls. We're down 1.3 million state and local government jobs since February, slashing programs. And there's no more effective way to help the economy and to help these states and support these jobs and providing federal government aid to state and local governments. And, this is not anything that's unusual. This is tried and true economic support. This is what we do every time we get into a recession, particularly in one like this one. And, it's pretty much a slam dunk, pretty straightforward kind of economic policy.
So Glenn threw out a number. He threw out 500 billion as a number that he would try to convince people to rally around. I'm thinking we should go back through the list again of everyone and have you weigh in on what you think a reasonable number is here. Obviously, we've got a Democratic proposal that's close to $1 trillion. We've got a White House proposal that's around 150 billion. Many studies have come out all over the map. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities was 555 billion. National Governors Association, 500 billion just for states. Moody's, where Mark Zandi is from, they said about 500 billion, possibly up to 750 billion if things get worse again. American Action Forum, a more right-leaning group, had said 230 billion. So we've got a lot of different numbers from smart people. Tell us what you think is reasonable. We'll go backwards this time. Mark, why don't you start?
Sure. And if you're interested, if you Google Moodys Analytics stress testing states, you'll run across a white paper that lays it out state by state. And we come up to close to under our baseline economic outlook. We come up to a number of almost 500 billion for the state and local governments through their fiscal year 2022. So over the next 2 years through June of 2022. And of course, that's the baseline outlook, and that makes a number of key assumptions, one of which is that we get a fiscal rescue package that helps the states. Because if we don't do that, the economic outlook would be even worse and the budget needs even greater. So, and in that paper, we lay out our estimates state by state. So you can see, what the budget shortfalls are, and we account for the rainy day funds. And I should say one other key assumption we make is that it's about 500 billion, assuming all of the rainy day funds. And by the way, they were very large and ample across nearly every state. Only 3 states did not have a rainy day fund of any size coming into this. Every other state had an ample rainy day fund. But assuming that all that rainy day money is used, it comes up to close to $500 billion. And I think that's what we're coalescing around, that number, because that is the right number. That is, if you do the arithmetic, the calculations, that is the amount that's needed to fill that budget hole. One final thing I'll say is there's a lot of uncertainty around all of this. And so if one were king for the day, a prudent policymaker would err on the side of doing too much rather than too little. That's a key policy principle, that if you're in a world of extreme uncertainty, and I think this qualifies, you want to go big, you don't want to go too small.
And Mark, just quickly following up on that 500 billion figure, are you thinking that needs to be done now? Like they should just pull the trigger now on the full amount?
I would. I think that there's only so many times we're going to be able to go back to this well. And here we are ready to drink. Let's drink, And again, there's a lot of time between now and the next time we're going to be able to take a crack at this, given the political calendar. And we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have no idea how this thing's going to unfold over the next few months. And so in that context, I think, and interest rates are pegged at 0, perfect time to use fiscal stimulus and deficit finance. So use this opportunity to fill that budget hole now.
Josh?
Yes. So I would have a number a little higher than that. I mean, one thing I like about Mark's approach to calculating this is in the paper, he's transparent about every percentage point of excess unemployment gets you a need for state and local aid of X amount, and then apply it to a forecast. I think he made the point in there that if you're thinking about the risks of overshooting versus undershooting, I would much rather overshoot on this one. I think undershooting is bad economically. It leads to all the problems we talked about. And I think the fact that we're having this discussion with 0 aid since the very limited rigid aid of the CARES Act, it says that, the political risk of having to go back to Congress again if we undershoot, the idea that they will quickly get to it and pass something seems not likely to me. And then also, I think there is an issue about, we all agree that the states are not facing a fiscal crisis because of anything dumb or bad they did. They're facing a crisis because there's an international pandemic. In that case, the cost benefit of making them plow through their rainy day funds when we have, less than 0 real interest rates, and we could just have the federal government hold states, keep them at their pre-COVID status quo when there was nothing irresponsible or bad going on. I think we should hold them to their pre-COVID status quo. And in fact, we should even top it up, because COVID is where state and local governments are on the front line of meeting a lot of the excess demands on spending that COVID is putting on people, the investments we need to make in public health and in schools. So, I mean, my number is closer to $1 trillion by the end of 2021 for all of those reasons.
Jason, you want to weigh in for a minute?
Yeah, so I would do at least a $500 billion block grant. But then what I would also do is additional assistance that was triggered based on economic circumstances. I have a proposal with Matt Fiedler of Brookings and Willie Powell of the Harvard Kennedy School that takes the Medicaid matching rate and makes it a function of state unemployment rates. It would eliminate 2/3 of the budget shortfalls on a going forward basis. And, I have to say, a year ago, the proposal seemed important to me. Now it seems incredibly important, because I have not increase the probability I attach to Congress acting in a systematic, rational, and timely manner on state and local assistance in the last year. So, so I think we both need temporary money, but we also need permanent triggers. And I should say something like that was passed as part of the HEROES Act, passed by the House.
Big yeah.
So for me, three quick points. One is on uncertainty, just to underscore what's been said before. This is not a time to be timid. Again, a lesson we learned from the financial crisis is the cost of that. Second, on the American Action Forum, my reading of what Doug Holthagen sent out this morning was he was netting out the 150 from the CARES Act, part of which went for other things. So 380 was kind of a gross number. And he was ending in 2021. And at least the numbers I was talking about, I was thinking of at least through 2022. So some of this may be a little bit of an apple and an orange. On the 500 billion, I 100% agree with what Jason said about triggers. I think it's very important for two reasons. One, it will help in the present situation. But two, it will put more on autopilot a problem so that we're not constantly struggling with Congress in the middle of crises. The second thing that I think would make it cost more than 500 billion would be more aggressive aid for education. So the 500 billion would be a number for a block grant, but I still think there's an argument to be made for additional funds for public universities and for community colleges.
I want to take a little different tack. I agree with everyone else on the panel, but one of the things we throw out these numbers, but we don't actually say what it really means. And so when we think about state localities, I want to separate that out because we have 50 states plus territories and DC and Puerto Rico, but we have 90,000 local governments. So we're talking about counties, school districts, special districts, and they all serve residents, and they all serve residents with public services. So when we're thinking about money to them, we want to think about what do they need that for. The other thing I want to focus on is that January 2020 was not a good status quo for a lot of the country. And a lot of the country has been struggling, especially since the Great Recession. I'm probably going to sound like a broken record on this event today, but rural communities have been struggling. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, K-12 spending was cut, so that led to lower student outcomes, but also less maintenance and less infrastructure. Those infrastructure issues are harming them now because of the pandemic. So when we think about this money, it's not about what's happening right now, but it's also helping them kind of get up to speed from some of the issues that they had before. So as we talk about numbers, let's also talk about what the numbers are going to be used for and where everyone is at that position.
Yeah, that's a great point, Binga. Let's pick up on that. I think when I first thought about state and local aid, my mind immediately went kind of where President Trump's tweet goes. Of course, we need more money for these first responders that are on the front lines of this pandemic. But there's so much more than that. Glenn was mentioning education. There's so many more facets to what this aid looks like. And I think when we talk about it as a big lump sum, we miss some of these pieces. Can we sort of say beyond kind of money for first responders, what else do policymakers need to be thinking about here that also needs to be part of this calculation? Everybody seemed to have good answers to this. Josh, maybe we'll start with you.
I mean, if you just look at, the big ticket items on state and local budgets, education and health are two of the huge ones. On the health side, I mean, I've already mentioned, like, if you look at the data on Medicaid enrollment since February, it's up probably about 4 or 5 million. It's probably just going to get worse than that unless we somehow get a really rapid job bounce back. States carry a big part of Medicaid costs. And so that's one big thing. And then education, I mean, the idea that we're just not laser focused as a society on making sure schools get every resource they need in order to open safely is sort of mind-boggling to me. And educating safely and effectively in the midst of a pandemic is going to be a much more expensive endeavor than doing it normally. And it's normally pretty expensive and we should spend more on it, but doing it in terms of getting, more staff, because you have some kids who are online and then maybe some places are going to have hybrid, so they'll have kids in person. Having more people on staff who can help with the technology issues and actually provide some more sort of tailored one-on-one instruction to kids who are otherwise going to drift because they're not in a classroom in person with teachers. I mean, equipment, all the things you can name. So I think education and health, that's what state and local governments really spend a huge chunk of their money on, and the demands on both those things because of COVID have just really been amplified.
So from an economic perspective, I'm not sure the federal government needs to put a label or a purpose on it. I don't mind block grant. You need some things like maintenance of effort rules, can't use it for tax cuts, maybe can't use it to fund your pensions or something like that. I think then almost every state's going to get to everything on Josh's list. When it comes to the label, I think there's some economics to the choice of the label, but I think the ratio of politics to economics is even higher. So if people are happier with an unconditional block grant and let the states decide, I'm happy with that. If people are happy, if you call it healthcare or education, I'm happy with that too. Certainly in the transition in 2008, as we were putting the Recovery Act together, we originally had an unconditional block grant. Our political advisors said, oh, you'll never be able to sell that, make it sound better. And we changed the label to health and education. We knew a bunch of that money was fungible, and we didn't mind that a bunch of that money was fungible. So I think there's some economics here, but I think whatever message gets the money out is fine with me personally.
Glenn, can we pick up on that? Oh, sorry, Mark. Why don't you weigh in, and then we'll.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I agree on the economics, but on the optics, I think it is important to point out that, well, really two things. One, the folks that work in state and local governments, these are middle income Americans. The typical wage for a state and local government worker nationwide is $65,000 a year. That's right in the middle of the distribution. So this is America that we're talking about. And there are a lot of jobs. There's, close to 15 million jobs here that, are in state and local governments. So I think that's critical. I think the second thing is that's important, at least from the optics of all of this, is that people tend to forget that the services provided by state and local governments are necessary services. This isn't luxuries. I mean, this is, the daily blocking and tackling. This is, daily life, protecting our streets, collecting the trash, making sure that, if a storm blows through, and by the way, this has happened 5 times already this summer, and it knocks down trees and your power lines, that someone's going to come out and fix it. The utilities, but a lot of state and local government workers are, involved with all of that. So we rely heavily on these services, and people tend to forget that. And I think it's important that, that we remind people of that that's what we're giving up here when we're not helping out these states. And those are the services we're going to lose if we don't provide this support to those entities.
I want to pick up on jobs in just a second. I think that's incredibly important discussion. But let me just stay on the point that Jason raised for a minute. Glenn, I'm curious to get your take. We hear from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, often that he doesn't want this money to go towards bailing out pension funds or go towards paying for things that aren't really disaster related, aren't related to this crisis. What safeguards do you think should be around any money that Congress might approve for state and local?
Well, as I said earlier, I do think this is an issue on the Republican side. I mean, the two reasons to really champion all this writ large are the public goods element that everybody has been talking about. State and local governments actually are on the front lines providing public goods. The other is the obvious aggregate demand effect, the contraction that's going to happen. I think the right way to do it is to do some kind of rule that just says you can't use it for either reducing taxes or bailing out pensions. Are those things ironclad? Well, no maintenance of effort rule is really ironclad, but I do think it would enable Congress to send the right signal. I agree with Leader McConnell. You wouldn't want to use this money in that attempt right now. But I also think if an overweight person comes to the ER with a heart attack, you treat the heart attack before you lecture him or her about weight. And that's the way I feel here.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch to jobs. This comes up every time we start talking about state and local, that if we're really worried about getting people back to work, we've already seen over 1 million job losses in state and local governments. But there was something kind of interesting in the July jobs report. There were actually job gains for state and local. We're still way down from where we were pre-pandemic, but there were some slight gains. And some are using that and saying, hey, look, maybe things are already turning around in state and local. Jason, Mark, I know you know these numbers so well. Is there anything to make there? Is there any kind of an argument that state and local is turning a corner?
No, that is sorry, Jason, go ahead.
First of all, there's weird, funky things around seasonal adjustments. So
That's it.
I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to what's happening month to month. Second, I'd never make policy based on, volatile month to month numbers. Third, the broad story, as you said, a lot of jobs have been lost. And fifth, a lot more jobs will be lost. And a lot of those job losses we've seen will become permanent if we don't get this money. But there's weird stuff going on in seasonal adjustments, so I just wouldn't look too much for month to month.
It revolves around largely around teachers, because they typically leave at the end of the school year, which is June, but mostly July. But of course, with the pandemic, they left in earlier, April, May, they left. And so the measured job losses in state and local government earlier in the pandemic were overstated. So you remember we got those huge, massive 100,000 job decline, which was quite perplexing because it happened so rapidly. It was overstated. And that's all this bump we got into July is just reversing that. So the net of all of that is, as of July, the reality is, accounting for all the seasonal adjustment issues, we are down 1.3 million state and local government jobs. That is a very good estimate of the damage that has occurred. And that's a lot of jobs, again, middle paying jobs. So we're now past these seasonal adjustment issues, but that bump was just a technical issue.
And Mark, I believe you or your team has an estimate for how bad it could get. I think it might have been, I saw as many as 2.8 million jobs. Can you talk us through how you look at, that's a pretty grim forecast when I look at that.
Well, I think that exercise, I've been asked to do a lot of different exercises, but that one exercise I think you're referring to is what if state and local governments don't get any additional support here? What kind of job losses could we expect? And of course, we're making a boatload of assumptions around, where they're going to make cuts and what else they're going to be doing. But if that's the case, then, I think we're probably not quite halfway done the job loss. We'll probably end up losing several million state and local government jobs when it's all said and done. But that, obviously depends on lots of different things.
And would that potentially be worse than the Great Recession from over a decade ago?
Oh yeah. I actually don't remember what the job losses were. Maybe I can pull that up when someone else is talking and let you know. But I think that's worse what happened in the Great Recession. Yeah. But I'll do that right now while you guys are chatting.
All right. Bingo, I want to go back to you. You made that great point about rural earlier. I think often this is portrayed sometimes by some lawmakers, particularly some Republicans, that this is to bail out the New York cities and the Illinois, these sort of blue states or blue cities that haven't managed well, is one of the arguments that's often made about why we should be hesitant to go big here on the aid. Obviously, a number of Republican governors have been very outspoken that they need help too. Can you give us some context on, is this really just a blue state or blue city issue?
Well, I like the point that Mark made earlier that states have actually done really well in their rainy day funds. So they've actually done what they're supposed to do before a recession hits. So they've done what they're supposed to do. But the reason why I focus on rural areas is that January 2020, a lot of rural communities were already, struggling. And so some of the work that I've done earlier this year has looked at what they are doing in terms of infrastructure. And so I just want to bring up a small example in Milledgeville, Georgia. It's a small rural town in Georgia, predominantly African-American. I was speaking with the superintendent and they have provided Chromebooks. They provide PPE using some of that CARES money from March to help out with the school. But it's not just about providing Chromebooks. They actually have to provide Wi-Fi hotspots. So they actually have to purchase school bus, outfit them with Wi-Fi hotspots, and then drive them around the community so that kids can use do the homework. And this is not just, Milledgeville, Georgia. This is in Utah. This is all throughout. I mean, there was one place, I think it was in Washington State, where the hotspots are for kids to, use it for school, but also for people to apply for unemployment insurance. And you just think about, these people are struggling pre-pandemic, and the pandemic has made it worse. And then this is where that money comes in, because who's providing the money for education? Well, state and local governments. And they have to make these decisions that, we're talking about a status quo that's not the case throughout. And so that's why it's even more important. And it's not a blue state, it's not red states, it's all the states. And it's major cities and small towns. And everyone needs this, especially thinking about school starting up now in the next couple of weeks.
Glenn, do you want to weigh in on this for a minute? You're in a lot of these Republican talking circles. Kind of what are you hearing is about other states, maybe more red states or areas that might be in real need here?
Well, I think they're definitely real need. You're hearing this from governors. I won't mention the state, but I was on a call earlier with state leaders in a Republican state, and reminded them to talk to their congressional delegation and senators about this, that this doesn't happen to be a state that's dominated by these big city problems. So it's a matter of educating members.
I want to specifically bring up the state of Illinois. This comes up in the city of Chicago. This comes up in almost every conversation. My parents actually met in Chicago. When I told them I was moderating this panel the next day, their first response was, "Oh boy, I hope we don't bail out, Chicago and Illinois. They've got so many problems." So there's definitely a view of this sometimes. I don't know, Josh, are you familiar with? How can we explain to people like my parents that this is about more than Illinois' years of issues?
So I'm not an Illinois or Chicago expert. I mean, I will say, this is the fiscal crisis coming upon us is not only hitting Illinois or Chicago, and it's not only hitting whatever you think the 100 worst run cities in America are, it's hitting absolutely every state and local government. And it's because it's being driven by this enormous economic shock coming from the pandemic. And I think one thing that people need to realize, and it's related to the jobs issue that people were just talking about, like when people do estimates of like how many fewer jobs we'll have a year from now, say, if we don't do any aid to state and local governments, the majority of those jobs are going to be private sector jobs. I mean, you're going to have the first round effects are on the sort of public employees we've been talking about. But then as they lose jobs and income, they're going to have to pull back their spending. And so people who work in the private sector, who sell them groceries or clothing or restaurant meals, they're going to start losing their jobs because demand for that stuff will go down. And plus, there's lots of private sector suppliers to the public sector. People who supply textbooks, desks, police cars, all of those things. So this is not just protecting public employee jobs. That is sort of the first round effect, but it also keeps the public sector fiscal crunch from boomeranging out and spilling over into the rest of the economy and dragging on private sector job growth as well.
The last one, let me just encourage people to keep sending in questions. I've seen a ton of great audience questions and we're about to turn to those, so please keep sending them in. But the last one I just wanted to throw out to our panel, sometimes I hear, why can't cities or states just borrow more money, and then to cover this year or next year, and then they can alter their operations and hopefully the economy may be back by 2022. So the borrowing question, and then obviously the Federal Reserve has done this sort of municipal lending facility to help make that a little bit easier to borrow money. So again, I sometimes hear like, well, the Fed's taken all these actions, isn't that enough? I don't know, Jason, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so states have balanced budget requirements. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why they went into this with generally very prudent budgets, generally large rainy day funds, and then, a 100-year flood hit. Even if they didn't have those balanced budget requirements, we would still want to do this because any given state, if they went out and tried to borrow, their interest rates would go up a lot because people would worry that they were irresponsible, first of all. Second of all, when a state cuts back, it doesn't just hurt themselves, it hurts all of their neighbors. And they might not fully take that into account. The federal government can borrow much more cheaply. And the federal government cares about all the states, not just one or a few states. And so because of what we would call a collective action problem or a spillover, it's both harder to borrow for one state because they would get labeled as irresponsible. There's less of an incentive to spend for one state because they don't get all the benefits of it. And so this very, very much at a time like this makes sense for the federal government to be doing.
Heather, can I point out that back to Illinois, it's really an outlier in terms of its fiscal situation and fiscal profligacy coming into this. And in fact, just to make that point clearer, they're the only state that's borrowed from that Fed facility that you mentioned. And states constitutionally can't borrow for operations. They can borrow for capital expenditures, depreciable assets, but they can't, under their own constitutions and rules, can't do that. So they're bound here to cut if they have a revenue shortfall. They have, they'll try to work around it, and there's all kinds of things they can try to do to delay timing, and they'll try all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, if their revenues are falling, they're going to have to make expenditure cuts.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I want to turn, we've got tons of great questions from the audience, so let's turn to some of those. The number one will probably not surprise you, and that is, how are we going to pay for this? There's some questions obviously about the federal debt and the deficits that the government is running. I know any of you could take that one. Does somebody want to make the point on how we pay for this?
The federal government right now has the lowest interest rates it's had, I think, ever. Adjusted for inflation, interest rates are actually negative. So when we borrow $100 today, a decade from now, we give back dollars that are worth $99. The whole key to this economic crisis is borrowing to smooth your way through it. You see, businesses doing that. You see some households doing that. But the best entity to do that borrowing is the federal government. And that's what it would effectively be doing on behalf of states and localities. That's what it's effectively doing on behalf of households when it does things like unemployment insurance and stimulus checks. That's effectively what it's doing for businesses when it does the PPP and the various lending and other programs it's done for businesses.
That's pretty comprehensive. Does anybody want to add another point there?
Well, I don't think we have a choice, right? I mean, it's a Hobson's choice. There's no good choice. We're taking the least bad choice, right? I mean, if we don't deficit finance to support the economy evaporates and our fiscal problems will be even worse. So, the best option here is to be aggressive, particularly in the context of the zero interest rates, and support the economy, bridge us to the other side of the pandemic. And then when we get back to full employment, hopefully sooner rather than later, that's when you start focusing on becoming fiscally disciplined. You really think about, and when you're in the best part of the economic cycle, which we were back in 2017, you don't cut taxes, you work on, trying to, or raise spending, you work on trying to prepare for the next crisis or the next recession. But this is not the time to do that. This is the time to be aggressive and get us to the other side, because if we don't, our fiscal problems will be even worse.
I'd say just one thing on that as well. I think Mark's point is really well taken, and just to emphasize it, like, to the degree that people with good faith worries about deficits and debt, or it's, a fear that you're somehow sacrificing future growth by alleviating the crisis today. But another thing that sacrifices future growth is letting the economy linger in a depressed state for a really long time. I mean, literally the thing that sort of textbooks worry about in terms of deficits and debt is that not enough productive private investment will happen if you take on deficits and debt. But every year that you let the economy sit in a depressed state is a year where that productive private investment is also not happening. Like, businesses are not going to start building a bunch of new hotels until there's actually demand for hotel rooms again, when the virus is solved and there's demand back in the economy. So I think you have to think about solving the economic problem in front of you and setting the conditions to getting back to full employment as quickly as possible is exactly an investment in the future. And that's what you have to weigh against any possible future effect on growth of deficits and debt. And as Jason and Mark said, in this case, I just think it's a slam dunk, which is the better choice in front of us. It's to take on the debt now in order to provide the relief and rapid recovery the economy needs.
I want to bring up another great point from the audience. Somebody asked and says, we haven't talked much in this discussion so far about transit, water, and sanitation. Some of these other local entities, hospitals could probably be in there as well. I was just looking before this panel at the lists of downgrades, debt downgrades by the Moodys and Fitches of the world, and I was struck by New York Transit Authority, the New York subway system has been downgraded. Several hospitals in Pennsylvania have been downgraded. Does anyone want to pick up on the needs of these types of local entities as well?
Well, I think they're very important on certainly for hospitals and healthcare. They're part of critical public health infrastructure that needs support on its own. Likewise, transit is a vital infrastructure. You can't operate major urban areas like New York City, where I live, without viable public transportation and can get people to work or children to school. So I think there's abundant need there. But I would still put it as part of the general category of the public goods that state and local governments provide.
And is that, Glenn, would that be covered by the block grants we're talking about, or would that
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Well, yeah, education may be separate, but yeah, everything I've mentioned would be part of a block grant that governors and mayors would figure out.
Okay. I want to bring up another great one that we haven't touched much on so far. Somebody asked, can you talk about the racial and gender equity impact? What sort of, if we don't do the state and local aid, is there some concern that certain types of people work in these jobs and would be disproportionately hurt? All right, Benga, yeah.
So actually EPI has written about this, but the government has always been historically one of the best places for racial equity in terms of not just having jobs, but good jobs. As Mark mentioned, these are median income of $65,000. And so as we cut these jobs, it's disproportionately African-American, it's also disproportionately women. And so what's gonna have, it exacerbates this inequality. And so one of the things that we have to think about is that these jobs, and again, when we talk about government jobs, it's not just large cities, it's not just DC, but there's a lot of good jobs, federal, state, local jobs throughout the country. And in fact, in a lot of places in rural communities, that's kind of like the one place. And also want to bring up the post office. Post office is a place that needs a lot of money. But the important thing about the post office is that's the place where a lot of these people who live in rural communities get mail, able to do a lot of business, get their medication. And so all this kind of goes into helping people out. And so there's inequality across race, gender, age, geography that providing state and local relief will help to fix.
Yeah. Well said. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that before I have a different question from the audience to move?
Well, I'll just point out that state and local governments also implement a lot of social programs that are key to underserved communities. I mean, you can see that across all forms of social assistance. I mean, I know the housing market better than other markets. And, without state and local governments, many housing needs would go unmet. And of course, in the current pandemic, the housing issues are quite acute, particularly around evictions, potential evictions. And I'm guessing, towards the end of the year, beginning of next, when forbearance comes off of many more mortgage loans, we are going to see increased foreclosures as well. So I think housing is a really good case study of, how important state and local governments are. They are on the front lines, they're right in these communities and they implement a lot of these programs. And if they're impaired because they don't get appropriate funding, these programs, they'll get cut and they won't be implemented, and we'll have just more significant housing shortages and other forms of other social ills.
We've got a couple of questions that are asking, I would say, about more creative solutions. Somebody has brought up North Dakota. My colleague Andrew Van Dam wrote about this recently at the Washington Post, that North Dakota has this public bank they started. And somebody asked, would this be a good period for other states to open their own version of this public bank to leverage more money that's either granted or loaned to them? either from the Fed or in a new stimulus bill. I don't know if anyone's looked at the North Dakota model. It's pretty unique, but are there either that or are there other creative solutions here that could be done to help this extraordinary situation?
I haven't looked at North Dakota. It might be that a state facing constraints needs to do something creative. But in general, these types of banks, public-private financing, et cetera, involve some entity borrowing that borrows at a higher cost than the 0.6% that the federal government borrows at. So almost every one of those types of things may be what you have to do if the federal government doesn't do its job, but are really dominated by getting it right and doing it uncreatively with a block grant or labeling your block grant around something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I forget who said it before. This is a really well-studied topic in economics. Like, this works. When you do federal aid to state and local governments at the scale that's needed, you largely hit a lot of the problems you're trying to hit. So this is not a problem of we just haven't found the solution yet. It's just we've never done the solution at the scale it needs yet.
There's been a couple of...
Heather, the other thing I'd point out is, it's a matter of timing, right? I mean, we got a problem like right now. Nice idea to experiment and try new ways and establishing new institutions, but that's a process, right? That takes time. We don't have time. People are going to lose jobs. The programs are going to get cut. The hit to the economy is like now. So, I think that's great that states are thinking more creatively, and they should, because this is going to be a long problem. This isn't, this is going to go on for a while here. We're going to work through this over the next several years through the middle of the decade. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But, there's no substitute for the support that the federal government needs to provide like right now.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about taxes. Obviously many of you made the point that if we don't get more aid for state and local governments, we're probably going to see services cut, jobs cut. Several people have asked, are there any of you have an estimate about how much taxes might go up to try to cover these shortfalls? And some people have sort of made the point, why can't we tax maybe millionaires or billionaires more to help pay for some of this? Maybe I'll look towards some of the forecasters, Mark or Jason or Glenn.
Well, typically what happens is they go to fees, right? That's the typical way of going about trying to address this, at least initially. So you think back to the financial crisis, the response state and local governments had to their budget shortfalls. Oh, by the way, I know you asked a question about government jobs back in the financial crisis. It was flat throughout the crisis, and it actually fell after the recession. It fell 700,000 jobs, from peak to trough. Now we're down 1.3 million. Also, I made a mistake. I don't know. I think I said 15 million state and local government jobs. Before this mess, there were almost 20 million state and local government jobs, just to set the record straight. But think back to the financial crisis. The way that the governments responded was jacking up fees, which, by the way, is creating a boatload of problems in the expansion and now. The affordable housing crisis is in large degree because of all the fees that were put in place onto the housing market. It raised the fixed cost of building homes. And so builders didn't put up affordable homes, rental or for home ownership. And we were left with this massive shortage of homes that, to this day is a problem coming into this pandemic. So that's typically the way, they respond, because getting a tax increase through, particularly in a stressed environment, obviously that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And both from an economic and a political perspective, that's pretty tough to do.
Yeah, I just don't think as a general matter now is the best time for tax increases. In fact, one of the arguments for this is preventing them. I don't think tax increases on millionaires would do much, if anything, to hold the economy back. But there's no tax increase on millionaires that could raise $500 billion in a single year done at the state and local level. States and localities have some, I think they could have more progressive tax systems than they have now, but they have a greater constraint on their progressivity than the federal system because people can move between states much more easily then they can move out of the United States. So there is no tax solution to this that is feasible at above $1 million of income, and there's no tax solution that's desirable if you broaden it beyond that.
Yeah. Glenn, I want to turn to you. I know you might have to leave us in a minute or two for your next Zoom meeting. We've got two questions sort of directed your way, I think. One is on kind of the politics, sort of what you think it might take to get a breakthrough on the Republican side on this issue. And the second one is a more technical question. Somebody asked, the CARES Act that was passed back in March lets companies defer pension payments for 6 months. And they ask, should we let cities and states do the same?
Gosh, on the pensions issue, again, that's just going to make the politics of this even harder. That goes right to the core of the GOP opposition. So economically, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with it, but politics, I'm not sure. As to what it takes to make all this happen, I'm just not sure. This is one of those things where economics and politics should go together. All the things we've been talking about are absolutely the right thing to do for the economy. They would also seem like good politics for both sides. So I remain a little bit mystified as to why we're not getting to yes, especially since the bid-ask spreads, while still wide, have come in a little bit. But I think part of the reason we're not seeing it is two. One is economics, the other is politics. The economics part is people do have a disagreement about the likely recovery. I do not share the optimism about a fast recovery that some conservative politicians seem to have. On the other hand, there may be others who think that politically they just won't be blamed for inaction. Both of those worry me.
That's well said. Yeah, Bingham, please.
I want to kind of pick up on that point and speak more broadly about this issue of why it's not happening. And so, been talked about, when is this going to happen? And so in July, I'm thinking, okay, July 31st, the UI benefit's going to expire. So that's going to push people to act. And if not then, well, then the jobs numbers that comes out a week later. And then nothing happened then. And then today they go home. And partially that's baffling given the data that's out there. And we see a lot of data about business closures, household expenditures, consumer spending. But then I think about the article that you wrote today, Heather, about this kind of divergent recovery. People talk about V-shape, the division sign or a Nike shape, but then there's this K-shaped recovery where there's a certain segment of population where it's actually going up and for the other part it's going down. And so there's a group, I think there's like a group of people who just don't feel this pandemic. I mean, yes, we're all here on Zoom, some people working from home, it's tough, but, and this also goes into the whole childcare debate that people who don't feel that are not going to be pressed to actually take action. So there's a group of people who aren't feeling the effects of this pandemic and don't feel that sense of urgency. And the question is, when are they going to feel that sense of urgency? And so they're coming back in September. There's going to be, the government runs out of money end of September. And that's probably going to be the next time that we may have this, which is very scary and almost criminal given what's happening.
We're about at the end of our time. We want to thank the audience for so many good questions. And I just want to give all the panelists kind of one last chance to weigh in and sum up kind of where you think we're at. Binga just said it pretty well on the timing front. Probably nothing happening till September, maybe even late September. Is there anything else that either you think can be done, maybe by executive action of the president, anything that can be done without Congress now, or anything that we should be watching for that could really change this debate and this game in the next few weeks? Glenn, we'll go to you, and then I know
I would say two things. One, obviously more presidential leadership to get Congress to act, both for aid for states, which we're talking about today, but just more broadly to shore up the recovery. Second, not really subject for today, but there's $454 billion that was appropriated in the CARES Act to stand up capital for Federal Reserve facilities that have barely been implemented. So there's money there without even going back to Congress. And rather than just focusing on executive orders, the president might ask his own Treasury Secretary to focus on on that. That would be my thought.
Jason?
You know, the time to have done this, as Benga said, was 3 months ago. The second best time to do this is now. You know, this is something we can do really cheaply at the federal level. It has benefits not just for the public sector, but for the private sector, not just for GDP, but for education, our children, and everything else. I think it's about as simple and obvious a public policy as I can imagine. And, you know, I don't think there's many ways around legislative action on it. You know, we studied whether we could do executive actions on this topic when I was in the White House. We came to the conclusion we couldn't. We did, you know, actually ask lawyers, which this White House may or may not do when it considers its executive action. So I just think there's no alternative to Congress acting. The sooner the better.
What about that idea Glenn just brought up? Some of that money that had been allocated to the Treasury to work with the Federal Reserve on mainly companies. It was supposed to go to companies, but do you think some of that could be repurposed?
I don't love that because I like, you know, Congress said that should be for lending programs. I think we should be using it much, much more aggressively for those lending programs. The municipal bond market has largely been stabilized. The problem isn't that states and localities are unable to borrow at a reasonable interest rate. It's that they have balanced budget requirements. And so they can't. So, you know, that might be legal. It might be the best you could do in the circumstance, but I think it's radically inferior to getting the level of resources we need for states and localities. And, you know, as Glenn and I have called for, using that fund much more aggressively for business lending.
Yeah. Josh, maybe from you, give us a little state of play on the Democratic side. Do you think we might see some movement a little bit lower than the $1 trillion number?
I mean, I have no insight there. I mean, I think, yeah, at this point, I would not have guessed at this point in the debate, the number would essentially be 0. That's what we've got so far. I do think, like I said, the risks are really much greater for undershooting than overshooting. And I think, you know, if you look at just the lesson from the Great Recession, basically my estimates are just the state and local spending austerity by itself probably delayed recovery back to pre-Great Recession unemployment by a matter of years, like 3 to 4 years later, just by the pressure of state and local, abnormally low state and local government spending. And Marcus said, you know, his forecast for the state and local spending pressure in front of us if we do nothing, like 3 or 4 times as great as what it was during the Great Recession. So I think, you know, every day we wait is another day we're locking in a sort of slower and more painful recovery. And it's, you know, well past time.
Binga, you sort of had already a good answer to sum things up, but do you want to add anything?
No, that was my point. Just there needs to be a sense of urgency.
And Mark, finally to you to wrap us all up here.
Well, you know, Heather, I think we just went off the fiscal cliff. We're in free fall, and we're going to see how bad this is, and that may be the catalyst for a rescue package. I mean, it's going to take you know, some real damage in the economy, maybe even the stock market. It seems like the president's focused on that as his litmus test. So we'll see how this goes. My guess is that it's not going to go so well, and the Congress administration will get it together. You know, I'll end with this. Maybe this, Winston Churchill. I'll botch this a little bit, but you'll get it. I think I'll get it roughly right. You know, I think he said this: Americans try everything and anything and ultimately do the right thing. I think we'll ultimately do the right thing.
Well, we'll stay hopeful here at the end of our panel, but obviously, as of today, it's not looking good. Thank you so much to Economic Policy Institute, to Thea Lee, and to our amazing panelists.
Thanks, everybody.